And here we are at the end of the road, Twisted Metal 2012, as yet the final game in the series, and what a game to go out on. Take that sentence for what you will. So this is a game that was technically the second game made by Eat Sleep Play, the successor to Incognito Inc., which was the successor to Single Track, though technically it was their first game, as their first real game was the PS2 port of Head On. And let's be honest, Twisted Metal 2012 is also their last real game, because following this game, David Jaffe left the studio, after which they exclusively developed iOS and Android slop. The same goes for the other successor to Incognito Inc., Lightbox Interactive, which made a few things including Starhawk, then moved into iOS and Android games in 2012, but made no games, and then just stopped existing without so much as a statement of closure. You know, I think the really depressing part is, the stars aligned for Twisted Metal Black to be made when the main portion of the developers at Single Track left to form Incognito Inc., and they managed to get Sony to sign off on making a new game, but we never really got anything like that again. Incognito Inc. died, and all the successors gradually faded away, and there's been no effort to get the band back together, so to speak, meaning that any efforts at having a core development studio for the series gradually faded away into nothing. And that's where we find ourselves today. How cheery. But enough about that. This was a game that took a few twists and turns during development. Originally, it was supposed to have an apocalyptic setting, but then Scott Campbell vetoed that idea. Then originally, it was supposed to be a multiplayer-only game, back before Fortnite, when people used to pay full price for that sort of thing, but then Sony higher-ups insisted that they include a single-player component. So this comes across to me as a bit of a mishmash game that didn't quite understand what it wanted to be, but still surprisingly, despite everything, came together as something good. With that said, this game's always been a bit problematic for me, not content-wise, like I'm sure some people will insist, more so for the ability to play. You see, these days, when it comes to most releases more than 10 years old, unless there's an up-to-date works-out-of-the-box PC version, I'll usually just emulate my games. It's easier, it's quicker, I don't have to deal with hardware struggles, and I get more options that way, but this is one game where that's simply not possible, or at least try as I might, I couldn't get it to work. I was hoping that RPCS 3 would have improved emulation for this game since the last time I tried. Unfortunately, this game is still borderline unplayable on that emulator. I seem to remember getting it to work on that emulator just fine before, but I may be thinking of PlayStation All-Stars, which works fine, but it's also designated with the in-game status much like Twisted Metal 2012. Still, same result either way. There's probably a way to get it to behave, but it's significantly more worth it just to play it on the intended hardware, which meant I had to break out the old dusty PS3. Me and this bad boy have had a lot of good times together, but even on official hardware, this game has given me no small amount of grief. I remember when I bought a physical copy from a secondhand retailer, I spent several hours trying to convince it to work, but the game would just not be persuaded to boot past the initial loading screen. And what's funny is, I recorded this back in 2021, back when I was still using my old Elgato. I still kept this footage around, I guess, because something told me that I was eventually going to use it someday. Incidentally, speaking of the physical copy, I have a poster of this game's cover which appears to have been stretched vertically. Why do I have this? Well, I was at Too Many Games a few years back, and there was a vendor selling posters with a deal of like 3 for $30, and I really wanted the Symphony of the Night poster, so I picked this and the Spyro poster because, well, those are things I like. And no, I'll probably never go back to Too Many Games unless I'm invited because I did not have a good time. Anyways, back to the game. This game has also been a bit problematic for me for the fact that it's unlike any other game in the series. While many of the ideas that the developers had during development didn't make the cut, one thing that definitely remains true is that this is a reboot. Depending on how much you want to stretch credulity, this could be considered the only true reboot in the series. Despite that, it's the same setup. There's this guy Calypso, he's this all-powerful godlike being who hosts an annual car combat tournament called Twisted Metal, and the winner receives a wish for whatever they want. More than ever in this case though, he's determined to twist everyone's wishes. Also, I don't know who plays Calypso in this game, but I never got over the fact that he looks like the bastard love child of Morticia Addams and Weird Al Yankovic. So what's different this time around? Well, unlike previous games that were basically built in the same way as arcade games, where you had multiple characters you could pick from that each had a unique ending, but otherwise much of the game was the same every playthrough, and as such, they were built for short playthroughs, endlessly replayable. Meanwhile, this time around, when they were instructed to make single-player content, they actually made a linear story mode. Yeah, how it works is that you have 3 individual stories that each have an establishing cutscene, a middle cutscene, and a conclusion. And they're all broken up by several levels, and no playthrough is completely the same as the last, but they do kind of go through the same motions. You'll get the same game modes, but in different levels, and sometimes presented in a different way. So it's kind of like the structure of the old, but also remixed to a certain degree, making it feel like an actual linear series of events rather than 3 identical playthroughs that all lead to the exact same conclusion. And you know what? I actually think the structure of this game is actually a good indication of how the series should have gone if it continued past 2012. Hear me out. Everyone is fond of the classic style where you have short playthroughs and each individual character has their own unique story and ending. Nobody's debating that. However, I do think that a setup like that is potentially limiting to the overall growth of the series. It's like having a fighting game that's only in arcade mode. Sure, that did the job in the 90s, but by the 2000s and especially by the 2010s, gaming had evolved to the point where basing an entire experience purely off an arcade-level experience didn't really cut it anymore. You need more content, and that's why things like Mortal Kombat have had structured story modes since like 2002, on top of their main tower mode or arcade mode or whatever you prefer to call it. So I do very much appreciate the fact that they decided to try and take this traditionally arcade game series and upend the structure, giving it a more modern style of presentation. But the big issue here is that they did this at the expense of the old school presentation, and that's the main reason I think this game doesn't really reach the heights it could have. It throws away the old in favor of something new, when in theory it could have had both. I don't know, maybe they didn't have the time or budget, or maybe it wasn't intended to be a very big game to begin with. But this strikes me as cutting off your nose to spite your face. You risk alienating old players by not giving them what they wanted, and you risk alienating new players by giving them a stripped-down 3-hour story mode. So does anybody really win here? I mean, I like the way they presented the main bulk of the content, but maybe I'm the odd one out here. Maybe I'm just more forgiving of this sort of thing. I don't know. Either way, 8 or 9 games in, it was nice to see them try something new. I have no idea what this game would have been like for a fan of the series paying $40 to play this in 2012. I can only judge this as someone coming into the series years after the fact. Plus, I actually think that presentation-wise, these stories are among some of the best in the series. The story of the 3 characters are as such. Our boy Needles wants to find the one that got away, the one person he's been unable to kill all these years, his daughter Sophie.
She needs to be gutted. Then I'll shove her in my icebox, and we'll be together forever.
Then there's Mr. Grimm, who in this case isn't the personification of death nor a psycho wearing his friend's skull. This time around he's an African-American biker whose father was a stuntman and tragically lost his life one day due to a stunt gone wrong. This led our boy Mr. Grimm down a dark path, although he's not inherently evil in the same way that the characters preceding him or proceeding him are, so they have to shove in a line about him killing people.
I've robbed people, killed people. Hell, some of the ones I killed, I know they didn't have it coming.
Either way, he wants to go back in time to stop his father from ever performing the stunt. Then there's Dollface, real name Krista Sparks. Yeah, same name as Calypso's daughter in the original timeline. I was kind of hoping this would result in some sort of story intrigue or some revelation, but no, it's just a reference. Though if you're like me and believe in the death of the author philosophy, you can interpret it however you wish. She's a supermodel and one of the greatest there is, but a car accident leaves her face moderately scarred, and some body dysmorphia leads her to believe that it's a lot worse than it actually is. Meaning she's desperate to try and fix it, but a shady doctor named Dr. Ospalak, get it, it's Calypso spelt backwards, makes her face perfect by putting a doll face over it. So now she wants the mask off.
And the doctor?
Miss Sparks, it's a tiny scar.
He wanted to stop me too.
They go for live-action actors put into a digital space in a way that's somewhat crude in its presentation, but still works for the surreal unreality that this game goes for. Like, it looks mostly believable, but also is slightly off as to activate an uncanny valley response. Plus, the thing I love about these stories for the most part is that this game is the right amount of f***ed up. It's not like something like Manhunt, which is f***ed up, but also grotesque and just unpleasant. This has a lot of off-putting imagery, but the whole story mode for these characters is filled with a sense of camp, intentional or otherwise, that makes these stories weirdly fun at times. Like when Mr. Grimm wins the contest, he makes his entrance by driving through the window of Calypso's penthouse apartment, and Calypso says this.
Hell of an entrance.
That is so stupid, I love it. How about when Sweet Tooth is hunting down his daughter at a hospital and just decides, why the hell not? I'm gonna kill every single person in this hospital, one by one, and you get a montage of his murder. It's like a parody of a slasher movie the way it's presented. Or like when Dr. Dwarf here puts the mask on Dollface, he activates the mask's locking mechanism by kissing it. Like, how can you look at this and not think, how are these people playing it straight? That's the thing. Because they are playing it straight, it means that in the odd occasion when there's a cutscene that's entirely meant to be taken seriously, or at least presented in a way that you can take it seriously, it is for the most part played chillingly straight. Such as Dollface seeing her scar as body horror level disfigurement, or the cutscene where Marcus Kane is gradually transforming into Needles Kane, talking about gradually breaking down his walls as Marcus Kane became more and more frustrated with his life.
It took me years of screaming and clawing and breaking him down. Years of calling out to him, trying to get him to set me free.
And then that culminates with the scene of him murdering his own wife and kids.
Shut up and bleed, you motherfucker. They all died so easily. Except for her.
I mean, what does it say about me that I think this is kinda cool? The best way to describe the presentation of the stories, the visuals, and honestly the game overall is metal as f***. There's something just so badass, but also appealingly grotesque about a lot of the way this game is presented, and I feel like being described as metal as f*** is what they intended, given the fact that this game's soundtrack is all metal all the time. At least in the original soundtrack. The licensed soundtrack has more rap and electronica and whatnot, but when it comes to all aspects of metal, from the grotesque, to the tryhard, to the cheesy, to the awesome, this game encapsulates all of that. And this all culminates with his ending, where he stupidly wishes to be taken to where his missing daughter is, and not for his missing daughter to be brought to him, because his missing daughter had been dead for years, leaving Needles buried alive. And then there's the scene where Mr. Grimm succeeds in going back in time to stop his father's death, but accidentally causes the death of not only his father, but himself, because he went back in time but wasn't specific and didn't think what would happen if a complete stranger showed up in the back seat of his dad's car, meaning that his younger self shot his older self. The only ending in this game that doesn't really work for me is Dollface's. Despite everything, she decides not to take the mask off, but instead wishes to be the greatest model in the world, specifically saying that she wants to be on the biggest runway in the world. The wording is a bit contrived because they wanted to have Dollface be on a literal airplane runway, only to have her be run over by an airplane. But you know what my issue is with this scene? Instead of just, getting out of the way, she runs in the same direction of where the plane is going. Or to quote an utterly trash YouTube channel, Dollface goes to the Prometheus school of running away from things. So that's lame, but there is also a secret final character story, though he is unplayable, at least in story mode. This time, there's a story surrounding Preacher, who isn't as off his rocker as he was in Twisted Metal Black. This time, he's determined to take out Calypso. Unfortunately, this is easily the most powerful version of Calypso in the entire history of the series. He runs a multinational company that controls the media, the army, the police, and so on, with an iron fist so massive that they're able to cover up the existence of the Twisted Metal tournament altogether, despite the massive collateral damage and death toll, and label people who try to bring it up as crackpots. So despite Preacher's best intentions and best attempts, he was no match for Calypso's power and ends up in the painting of tortured souls. The details of this prison painting are never really elaborated on, but I think it's a cool idea, but that's kind of the main thing I can say about the story of Twisted Metal 2012 is that it's a series of cool ideas. Unfortunately, that's all they are, ideas. Ideas that weren't fully fleshed out, because while the story structure in this game leads to the individual stories of the three characters having a lot more depth, well, except for Mr. Grimm, whose middle cutscene is given up to Preacher, it's still at the end of the day only three relatively self-contained stories with an overarching connectivity, meaning that a lot of the larger world-building aspects of the story are somewhat underdeveloped, when a more involved story could have led to more interesting results, but what are you gonna do? Overall, it just leaves me wanting more, which I guess could be considered a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective. Personally, I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, because I feel like this game leaves me wanting more because its ideas are somewhat underdeveloped, and not because it's just that good. But as the French say, c'est la vie. The story also informs the gameplay, because the setup entails you only playing as one of three different characters at any given time, and obviously they wouldn't want you to be confined to the same vehicle for an hour if there were only 3 hours worth of gameplay, so instead of confining every character to a specific vehicle, every character can play whatever vehicle they wish. And in free mode, you can mix and match the factions with whatever car you want, which doesn't actually sound that cool now that I think about it. Either way, you got a bunch of the classic hits including Sweet Tooth, Darkside, Axel, Crimson Fury, and Shadow, as well as a good selection of new vehicles, such as Vermin, Kamikaze, and my personal favorite of the new inclusions, Meat Wagon. I don't know why, but referring to an ambulance as a meat wagon will never not be amusing to me. Now, I found out that if you've completed a playthrough on one save file and unlocked all the different vehicles, every vehicle and every weapon is unlocked in subsequent playthroughs on different save files. I wanted to have an organic experience and unlock everything in the natural way. Unfortunately, that didn't really work out. I got on a different user on my PS3 and played through all the way to Dollface's story on a fresh save file, so I didn't have any advantages, but as it turns out, this game only allows one user on a console to have a save file for the game, so I lost my save and had to play through the same game over again. This time playing on the user with the completed playthrough, so at least I got a decent impression of what the game is like playing through on a fresh save. I just didn't get to the end. Not that it really matters, because I'll be honest, I wasn't really playing in an organic way to begin with. I was switching up my vehicles a lot more than I would normally, just to show off some of these cars. But here's the God's honest truth. If you're playing through this game on your own, if you're not playing a mission that requires speed, pick Sweet Tooth every time. If you're playing a mission that requires speed, pick your fastest car. That's all the advice you really need. Sweet Tooth in the game, and boy, it is sure weird to actually be referring to Sweet Tooth as the selectable vehicle instead of incorrectly as the person driving the vehicle for once. But anyways, Sweet Tooth may be dreadfully slow, but Sweet Tooth has some of the most health in the game, and on top of that has potentially the most overpowered special attack in the game. The Laughing Ghost. It may not be as powerful as other special attacks, but it's fairly powerful and respawns enough that it doesn't really necessarily matter that it doesn't do as much damage as other special attacks. The main selling point is that much like Spectre's missile from previous games, it phases through all objects and can target enemies from crazy far away. Basically meaning that as long as you're aiming in the direction of someone, you're almost guaranteed to hit someone with it. And that's pretty imperative when dealing with major battles like this. With a combination of factors like that, there were like a dozen vehicles I would never even touch if I wasn't trying to keep things varied for the sake of my own footage. With that said, there's also a vehicle that's almost its own secret easy mode, that being Talon, which is an actual helicopter that you can fly around. Here's the thing, it doesn't have the most health, and you're still at the mercy of people aiming up, especially when they throw the EMP at you. And when they do that, it can take a little while to get back into the air, but the fact is, when you're in a ground vehicle, you can only move in 2 dimensions, meaning that you have to account for terrain or buildings, and you're also on an equal playing field to everyone around you. So there were times when part of the challenge of these levels became the fact that some characters would stick to you like flies to shit. But that's just the way I like it. You're on an equal playing field, but they're using superior speed or firepower to try and take you out. There's never a dull moment in a lot of these levels because the CPU can be relentless. But Talon kind of does away with that because you can just fly to a high vantage point and take pot shots at enemy vehicles. Especially because the primary special attack is a free aim chain gun, or minigun, or whatever it's called. Even at a moment-to-moment level, if someone is on your ass, you can just fly over a wall that they can't, and suddenly you've gotten away. It's cheaper than a sparrow at a dollar store. I'm proud of that one. So cheap, in fact, it makes a lot of the game less fun. And while it's a good way to get through the game easier, I don't play games for speed, I play games to have fun. Hence why I'm not a speedrunner, and I just don't find this fun. There is also one particular vehicle I've never unlocked, that of course is Warthog. Get this, to unlock it, you need to get a gold medal in every single in-game mission on the hardest difficulty. Oh, well I guess getting a gold medal on every mission regardless of difficulty wasn't enough, eh? Oh, no, that's not too difficult of a hurdle. No, you should also make me blow an entire Thanksgiving dinner out of my left nostril to be able to use the special attack. I don't know, the series is known for being hard, and as a matter of fact is known for disrespecting its audience at times, but to do this is one of the most inaccessible feats that one could possibly put as a prerequisite for unlocking a character. And even if you download a save file to try and bypass this, it doesn't work due to some weird authentication type deal with save files. As far as the vehicle physics, this game is actually fairly unique in that it doesn't necessarily have a single one-size-fits-all style of physics for every vehicle. Obviously, there's only one physics engine, but wherein something like Twisted Metal 2, every car regardless of size felt heavy, but in Twisted Metal 3, regardless of size, every car felt light, this is the most varied as far as how vehicles have felt in the series. The faster cars will zip around with the greatest of ease and absolutely fly into the air with next to no effort. Meanwhile, the heavier vehicles feel like you're driving around in a brick. You know what? I appreciate that. It means that not every vehicle feels the same or similar. I kind of wonder what it is that makes this the case. I guess maybe by this point physics engines had advanced to the point where it was easier to make vehicles feel distinct within a single physics engine, almost as if they have different physics engines, but it's still the same engine. But with that said, the game still controls really well. 4 wheels on the ground and you're always in control, and the maneuvering is responsive and buttery smooth. While you do get knocked around a little bit more than I would like, it's almost lightning quick that you have your orientation be corrected, almost to the point that you never spend any time upside down. Though it is a bit funny that there are times when you get knocked around so thoroughly that you flip around like a pinwheel in such a way that, by all rights, the vertical G-force would rip your head from your body. Structure aside, once you get into the game, this is exactly what you would expect. Nice clean car combat with a range of weapons and a range of energy-based attacks. With a few minor inclusions like how you can run over people after you destroy their car for extra weapons and health. Doesn't really add anything other than an extra box to check when fighting, but it's something. Although one thing I will praise this game to the moon and back for is the energy attacks are now done by pressing a direction on the D-pad. That's right, no more lengthy codes. To shoot backwards, you just press down on the D-pad. To shoot the freeze attack, which is an EMP this time around, you just press up on the D-pad. Hallelujah, took them long enough. I mean, sure, some codes can only be done by pressing the triangle button and a direction, but that's a far cry from having to input 4 buttons just to shoot backwards. As far as the weapons, you have a good selection of the old as well as a few new weapons. My favorite of which would be the shotgun because it's extremely close range, but if you can get up in someone's grill and fire it off at point blank range, instant 60 damage. Even better is that every car now has a primary and secondary special attack. Some of the special attacks are lame and a number of them are recycled. If I recall correctly, I think 2 different cars have flamethrowers, 2 or 3 different cars have shockwave attacks, and I think 2 cars also have chain gun attacks. But when they get creative, man, it's pretty sweet. Like Reaper's chainsaw attack. If you do a wheelie, you'll grind the chainsaw on the ground, lighting it on fire, at which point it will do 150 damage. I like this practice of unwieldy and difficult to use special attacks that are stupidly overpowered because this can take out most vehicles in 2 shots, which in itself basically compensates for Reaper's low amount of health. I don't know what I ranked this in my video about special attacks, but whatever it was probably too low. Although the secondary special attack, the manual aim RPG, not so fun to use. Definitely not as fun to use as Vermin's secondary special attack where you can manually guide a missile. It's probably not super convenient to use outside of a one-on-one situation, but once again unwieldy to use but satisfying as hell because it does a ton of damage. By far though, the best special attack in this game and among some of the best in the series would be Sweetbot. Oh sweet Jesus, Sweetbot. You turn into a giant attack robot, and you can fly, stomp on the ground causing a massive shockwave, and even throw smaller, less powerful laughing ghosts. I will admit it's not as practical or as useful as other special attacks, and the fact that even in bot form, it still controls like a vehicle, but this is just too goddamn cool. I cannot say anything but good things about this. This really does reinforce to me that the one thing this game brings to the table more than anything is just cool ideas, and I feel like the alternate game modes are also a good example of that. As much as I love the old games to varying degrees, this game does make me realize that it is a bit of a missed opportunity to have never done anything different with the gameplay other than pure unfiltered car combat, because you can still do a lot with car combat while injecting a few new ideas into the concept here and there. The extra game modes in Head-On do not count. This game has the primary game mode of killing all the dudes, endurance mode where you kill X amount of dudes, but then you have things like Juggernaut battles where the Juggernaut will keep spawning dudes after a set amount of time. So it's a never-ending battle until you destroy the Juggernaut, which itself is a massive undertaking. It's a game mode that requires resourcefulness and strategy, and as a matter of fact, I found myself dying multiple times because I had a suboptimal playstyle and had to adapt for this mode. And any mode that forces you to switch things up while also keeping the gameplay the same is worth remarking on in my books, especially when it's as simple but enjoyable as this. The other one is the electric cage match. Basically, you have to stay within a certain ever-moving square on the map, and if you're outside of the square for long enough, you'll start taking damage. It doesn't instantly kill you for most of the situations, just so long as you're fast enough. And there are plenty of healing items around, and in some levels even a healing truck, which is another unique and interesting idea this game has. So you're rarely shortchanged on health. The only time I felt the electric cage gimmick was a bit annoying is in the Metro Square level, which has this giant ice rink that the cage will occasionally appear over, but maneuvering on and especially off this ice rink when you have a relatively short amount of time you can be out of the cage, That makes things a little bit less fun. Still, once again, a good gimmick that freshens things up without having to change the gameplay at all. I think the level design also really complements the game modes in a lot of cases. In themselves, these levels can be way too big, which is why I generally prefer when the game sections off certain parts of the levels for fights. That way you don't get that Twisted Metal 4 issue where you spend half the time traveling to the players in order to fight. But then again, this game has fast enough traversal that even that's not that bad, but even still, these levels are massive and they're also very detailed. Sometimes I just like to fly above these levels and look at all the scenery that no doubt some developer put a lot of effort into. Of all the levels, easily the best two are Black Rock Stadium and LA Rooftops. The former of which is a decently sized arena but not too big, and there's a lot going on and a lot of stage hazards to the point that it kind of reminds me of a terrorist reality arena on crack. There's so much going on here, but none of it gets in the way. It always enhances the action rather than takes away from it. Then you have LA Rooftops, because anytime you have a rooftop level in one of these games, it's sure to be awesome. This one is arguably once again too big, but it has so much going on, from the main chunk of the level spinning, multiple story buildings to drive around, several building interiors you can crash into that you can set traps in. Once again, a lot going on here, but it manages to stay relatively sober, and plus, the ever-present danger of falling off injects this level with a degree of excitement rarely seen. Though the worst level is Diablo Pass, easily. It's the same relative size as the other levels, except it's stretched out, so it seems a lot bigger and takes way longer to get from one end to the other. It's good for races, not so good for actual combat. The rest of the levels are pretty good, but not good enough for me to remark on. But what of those races I mentioned a minute ago? Well, this is something that I consider to be one of the lesser new ideas they implemented. Before I ever got into the series, I always assumed that there was a racing component because I had a hard time believing that a car game could exist without some sort of racing component, but in this case, something like 8 or 9 games in, they introduced one. And yeah, I'm not a fan. You only need to do this once per storyline, but I do not enjoy them. They're not well balanced. If you make one mistake, you're better off restarting because there's no rubber banding, especially problematic in those races with a heavy verticality component, and I just feel like this is too far out of the usual wheelhouse for the series that it doesn't feel like a natural inclusion. It feels like a big fat gimmick sitting in the middle of the game. But I just don't think the game is built in such a way that the engine can complement a racing component. In fact, the gimmicky nature of it is to the point that I'm not even sure if there's any way to do this outside of story mode, at least in single player. I'm sure you can do it in multiplayer, but this game's multiplayer died far too long ago for me to have experienced it. But even if I don't like it, I still do appreciate all the new ideas, because like I said earlier, for the most part, this game shows the direction the series should have gone if it had continued. But aside from that, it also shows where the series would have gone without a shadow of a doubt. What do I mean by that? Well, the most technologically advanced game before this, I would argue, would be Twisted Metal Black. Sure, Head-On came out later, but that was on pound-for-pound inferior hardware. And a lot of technological advances happened between 2001 and 2012. So this is as yet the most technologically advanced game in the series, and it is significantly more technologically advanced than Black, and it shows. I heard people say back in the day that this game looked below the bar for 2012, but I disagree. I actually think it looks really good, and the way they're able to utilize the tech is superb. You have dozens upon dozens of fully destructible buildings you can casually drive through, many pedestrians to run over, absolutely gobsmackingly massive levels, tons of interior areas to explore, endless details, and a maximum of something like 10 people you can fight in a single level. Though I wouldn't recommend it. There were times when I was fighting like 6, and even then I was getting bounced around like a pinball. This just shows how much bigger and better the series could have potentially been, but unfortunately, it didn't end up that way because this is as yet the most up-to-date version of what the series could be. And it makes me sad because while this game isn't necessarily the best in the series, it has the building blocks of what could have been the best in the series if they could have built on top of what this game was doing using newer technology. With that said, however, there are certainly aspects of this game and the technology that I could have taken or left, namely the 20-minute bosses. The first boss fight, the Brothers Grimm, is actually pretty good. It has a fairly standard setup. You have 2 giant monster trucks you have to fight, and they're both formidable in their own right, but once you destroy one, the other armors up. And you have to get your goon to the bowels of this armored truck and plant a C4, which will blow off the armor so you can take out the rest of its health. So you have to stop in the middle of the fight and get a little bit crafty with getting yourself under the monster truck for long enough that you can finish the fight. It's a small gimmick, but it's enough. And the rest of the fight is difficult, but in a relatively fair and exciting way. The final boss is Sweet Tooth's Carnival of Carnage, which is less of a boss and more of an entire challenge course. You have the underside where you blow up the face on the bottom of the carnival to access the main part of the carnival. Meanwhile, you have to avoid being crushed under the tires or destroyed by the other sweet teeth. Sweet tooths? Okay, wow, that's confusing. After that, you have to do this weird minigame where you have to summon a bomb-wielding clown and then ram them into a giant clown face 3 times. All the while dealing with several other clowns with chainsaws in this giant pinball table type deal. It's certainly creative, I'll give it that, but other than that, I really don't have much to say about this. And then we have the obstacle course. Boy, I remember the first time playing through this obstacle course. It was late, I was tired, I was attempting it for like 30 minutes before I decided, you know what, I'm gonna go to bed and try again tomorrow. It's a little bit tough, especially with these spinning blades of death, because you need a good amount of speed to get through, but sometimes the gaps between blades isn't enough to give you that speed. Plus, you're also dealing with bombs that are rolling around, and since they're physics objects, it's completely random if they'll get in your way or not. Still, this section is deceptively short, so no big deal. Finally, you have this giant clown crane thing. You have to destroy the sweet bots, and only then are you given a specific amount of time to grab them with Talon's secondary special attack and drop them into the head. You do that 5 times and bada bing bada boom. The actual boss fight is only like 4 or 5 minutes, while it's the rest of the level that takes a while, but seeing as no 2 parts of the level are the same, I actually think it's an interesting little showcase on how the game's mechanics can be switched up for different styles. But of course, I think the worst offender of the bigger isn't always better philosophy would be, and you all knew this was coming, Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden has been a particular punching bag for me over the years, and I've actually been told that I'm too harsh with this boss fight, but here's the thing, guys. Like I told you, I lost my initial save from when I was recording this playthrough initially, and I lost that save right after fighting Iron Maiden. Which means I had to fight Iron Maiden not once but twice, and let me tell you, repetition does not make it a better boss fight. And it all comes down to one aspect. It's way too f***ing long. So it starts out, and you have several dollface limos that you have to fight. You have to take out the red one, then drag the occupant over to the nuke truck and hold them there for something like 20 to 30 seconds so the nuke can charge up. But either before or during this process, you'll probably have to take out the white limos anyway, because while they're not the toughest, they can interrupt this process. And you can also be interrupted by Iron Maiden itself. Then you have to guide a tactical nuke into Iron Maiden not once, but twice. Not only that, but this thing can also shoot down your nuke, and the actual amount of time it takes to back Iron Maiden into the wall so you can hit it takes just shy of forever. And if you miss or have your nuke destroyed, you have to do the entire process over again, wasting another 3 or 4 minutes. Doing this once is obnoxious enough, but twice is just insulting. The only difference between Stage 1 and Stage 2 is the fact that in Stage 2 the nuke truck is on the move, which actually makes it slightly easier to avoid the white limos. Finally, the shield is down, and at that point you can fight it as a normal boss fight. It seems hard until you realize you can actually aim up, which is not something the game tells you, and you can only aim up, no other direction. Probably a mechanic put in specifically for this fight, but I would have liked the game to have an on-screen indicator to let me know, but then about halfway through the fight it shifts so that now you have an electric fence, and if you're outside of the electric fence for I think more than 40 seconds, you self-destruct and have to do it all over again. Finally, Iron Maiden is on its last legs, and you have to give it a few shots to the face to finish it off. And you think it's over, but no. Suddenly the head pops off and you have to take it out once and for all. It doesn't have that much health at this stage, but by this point I'm so far past done I just want to rip my hair out. If I had hair. Oh my god, I don't think the individual chunks of this boss fight are too bad taken on their own, but the relentless padding, the fact that you have to do 2 nukes instead of 1, all the stages, it's just so obnoxiously long. And the way certain parts of this boss fight are specifically designed to pad things out just kills my interest. I don't know how anybody thought this was a good idea. I've beaten this boss something like 4 times now, and I have yet to do it in under 20 minutes. It is still such a bitter irony that this boss fight is called Iron Maiden, because Iron Maiden is, if not my favorite band, at least top 3. And you know what? Given that they licensed a bunch of music for this game, it is a really big missed opportunity that they didn't license an Iron Maiden track for this boss fight. And I have the perfect song they could have used. The Longest Day. Oh, and since I'm on the topic, best Iron Maiden album? Dance of Death. Don't at me. So yeah, new isn't always better, but sometimes it is. Bigger isn't always better, but sometimes it is. Mixing things up isn't always better, but sometimes it is. And taken as a whole, I think this game is a bit of a mixed bag at times, but there is a lot of potential. However, you can't pay your bills with potential, and since the series died after this, the potential is somewhat unrealized. But even what is here, what was realized, is certainly worth remarking on. This is easily the most varied and ambitious game in the series by a wide margin, and even if it doesn't always hit all the notes it needs to, when it hits, it hits. And just the fact that the game has the technology behind it that it does creates a sort of novelty to the experience that elevates it in itself. But then you take into consideration the interesting level design, the remarkable physics engine, the variety, the new weapons, the new special system, and what you end up with is a really solid game. Maybe it's not the best game in the series because it is a little bit more scattershot design-wise than I would have liked, and I feel like it would have been better if they iterated a bit more, but for what it is, and despite its flaws, I enjoyed Twisted Metal 2012. I would probably consider it the upper part of the mid-tier for the series. It's a shame we never saw the next evolution of the concept, but I'm happy that this game exists, and I think it's a solid time all around. Even if it is a bit inaccessible these days, given the fact that it's stuck on the PS3 and is probably still a few years out from proper emulation, I still think it's worth your time. Though definitely don't try to unlock Warthog unless you're fully out of your mind. And that's the end. That's the final destination of the series until the TV show was made last year. And you want to know something? I'm not really hung up about it. I've said this before and I'll say it again, I'm the type of person who doesn't really mind things I like ending because if you count Lost, we got 9 games in the series. It's more than enough to be satisfied for me, plus the car combat genre goes far beyond this series. Granted, you'll be playing some really shitty games like Grudge Warriors. I'm still convinced that before I reviewed that game, nobody had ever actually played it. It's up there with the likes of Tai-Fu, Wrath of the Tiger, or Juggernaut as far as levels of obscurity. The only thing I'm a little bit disappointed in is the fact that this game ends on 2 separate sequel hooks that are actually really interesting. First, we have the only surviving Kane child, Charlie, digging up his father's grave and taking the mask, thereby taking up the mantle of Sweet Tooth, and also Calypso bringing Sophie Kane back from the dead as a female equivalent. That could have made for an interesting dynamic, but alas, it was a sequel hook thrown to the wind. Still, whatever happens, if the series comes back or stays dead, I'm not gonna lose too much sleep over it either way. But that's all I've got, so I'll just say what I always say. If you like what I do here, be sure to leave me a comment telling me what you think, like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I'm not sure when I'll be relaunching the Patreon, but it'll probably be within the next month or 2. But either way, if you want to pledge to the Patreon, feel free. Otherwise, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.